Let's talk about adaptive parts. So the adaptive parts are a response to the unclaimed parts. They emerge as a protection, as a coping, as a strategy of these somatic experiences that could not be processed in safety. The trauma experiences that got cut off and that couldn't be metabolized. And we have to somehow figure out how to cope with this horrible experience. They're often somatic. They start with somatic. They're not usually thought through. There are responsive patterns in the body, which are usually with, we talked earlier, could be a contraction, a tension, a pulling in, a cutting off. They're adaptive in response to. And right there for us as somatic therapists, we get the clue of how to work with it. Because adaptation is an evolution to the experience that I had prior, and I had to respond to something. So if you have to respond to something, then like, what's the pathway of your response? And that's a somatic pathway. How did you do that? And again, this is where the view comes in. Being a little bit in awe of how the person, how creative they were, how they created this adaptive part is a huge allying with the client's inner world, because they often don't think that these adaptive parts are so great, or they shouldn't have them, or, they have some kind of self-judgment about it. So bringing the utmost curiosity, like, wow, that was so clever that you survived that. That was so amazing that you figured out how to be strong and push through and be very industrious and figure things out by yourself. Or these are all different strategies of adaptation, right? Nobody was there to help me, so I had to figure it out by myself. That's a very culturally endorsed adaptive part, but it's in the moment when nobody's there to help you and you have to figure it out. That's a clever strategy, but that's not a clever way to live or create intimate partnership or create good community building, because it's going to really inhibit relationship building. So we can think of adapting parts as also protectors. So they're protecting the internal, disavowed, disconnected parts that are linked with the trauma and that are linked with the psychobiological state in response to the pain. And these protectors then often become identities. We begin to believe that that's who we are. But really, these protectors are in service of the crises back then, the parts that I couldn't really be with, the strategy that I had to create. They become a systemic protector. Protective parts are actually there to stabilize the trauma experience. So they're quite intelligent in the moment. And some of the protective parts can look like being vigilant. It's a very, very common one. So if my environment was not safe, I grew up in an environment where there was a lot of unpredictability or chaos or potential threat, and that was my lived experience, then it makes a lot of sense that I be very tuned into being vigilant. Yeah. And vigilance is a helpful survival strategy. In a moment of threat, we need to be vigilant. And in fact, if there is a true threat happening, our vigilance and our awareness goes into hyper-focus, and we're noticing every little detail. Very helpful and useful when there's a true threat. When there is no threat and I'm being in a vigilant state constantly, and I treat every interaction with vigilance, it's going to begin to interfere with my relationships. It's also beginning to create some chronic stressor in the body. And it's associated also with chronic inflammation in the body. That's been shown, that connection. So vigilance is a protective part because it's looking out for, is there any danger? And I'm going to be ready ahead of time, right? So the slightest little cue, and a classic example is a deer in the forest or a little squirrel, very fast twitching nervous systems, right? When you watch a squirrel, they're constantly vigilant, their body twitches, they have these fast moving muscle twitches, and every slight little movement and they're kind of bolting, right? So they're going into their fleeing response. So it's a great survival strategy. But you can imagine that these protective parts are also going to have an incredible cost. And that's really what we're working with when we're working with protective parts, the adaptive parts, bringing them together with what's underneath and what fuels the protective parts so that the person can relax and have a choice so that they'd always have to be vigilant. They can assess the situations like, is this really truly unsafe right now? No, it's not. I'm just sitting in a coffee shop and there's nothing happening. But the person that's chronically vigilant might be looking at every table, at the exits, right? And they're kind of anticipating there could be danger. I have to be ready. So that's a very, very common somatic experience. And there are some beautiful techniques, simple techniques such as the orienting response that's used a lot, where you're simply using the vigilant tool, which is looking around. You're looking around, assuring, if everything is okay in a conscious and slowed down way. And that's kind of a classic somatic tool that you can use, helping the client to become aware, oh, this is what you're actually doing. So this anticipating of potential danger, right, is a common protective part, and it's a strategy for coping. Right? It's trying to assure that I have connection, that I need to be safe, and where are my strategies to take care of myself. I had a client come in who on the phone told me, an older gentleman, who told me that he really wanted to work on his issues of loneliness. And he was pained that he wasn't in an intimate relationship, and he tried many times, and he felt like he couldn't really, he didn't understand why. And he took a lot of solace in spiritual pursuits and was very literate, was loving his books, but he felt lonely and disconnected. So we made an appointment, and I'm about to open my office door, and he's literally standing right at the door, almost like bumping into him nose to nose. He was anticipating coming into my room, but rather than sitting down in the waiting room, he was standing literally behind the door. So I was taken aback, and I was like, oh, hello. And his eyes were scanning me up and down and then looking into the room before he entered in. And I said, come on in. And his eyes were madly scanning the environment. And my office had 2 doors, had 2 exits, so that some clients had privacy and not having to go through the waiting room. And the client ran over to that door, checked on the handle, looked out the window, and literally was scanning like an animal the room. And he had his sweat pearls on his forehead, and you could clearly see that he was a little bit sweaty and his skin was flushed. He was very agitated coming to the session. Clearly, these were very strong signs. So tracking that, it's very obvious, but tracking that, I said, so this is a kind of a new environment, and we're just meeting, and you're already making yourself comfortable, huh? So just let's look around. Let's check out the office. What do you think about that art? Yeah, I don't like that. Where's that from? Well, that's from actually Bali, and gave a little bit of a story. And this was a very deliberate intervention. I was using his vigilance to orient him in the room so that I could help him to scuffle down to arrive in the session. And I said, well, how about behind you? And he turns around, which is also, again, using the orienting response, turning his head, moving his eyes, and he actually has to engage his entire polyvagal complex in order to do that. Simple intervention, but very effective. And he turned around and he said, I don't like that painting either. I said, wow, you have a lot of opinions and you really know what you like and you don't like, huh? That's a creative reframe. I could have also been offensive and said, well, that's a very prized art and I paid a lot of money for it. Or I could have done all kinds of responses. But knowing that he was so agitated and he didn't know how to arrive into the session, I basically used every micro interaction as a reframe towards the goal of establishing safety and having him arrive. So this went on for quite a while. And then he was sitting down and he started sweating and his eyes were still darting and he kind of caved in a little bit. And then I realized that I was the agitation. It wasn't just the room. Those were just representations. It was me. I was the agitator. And he didn't know how to be with me. And his issue was about relationship with women. He was extremely nervous, right? So I said, we just met. I don't know much about you, but I have a very kooky kind of question for you. Did you, as a little boy, like to build forts? And he goes, what? yeah, did you build little forts and out in the woods or at home with pillows or something like that? I said, oh, yeah, I love that. I love that. I like my dad and I would do stuff out in the woods, and told me a little bit of a story. And he's like, where's this woman going with that? I said, I've got a little bit of a crazy idea, but see how that feels to you. I have a bunch of pillows and we could build a fort and you could be behind it. And I couldn't even finish my sentence. You ran to my pillow stack. I built up these pillows. He rushed behind it. And then I heard, I said, this is good, huh? You can't see me. Yep, that's good. I said, you know what? Now that you have some control of not seeing me, I could also be quiet. Another big exhale. We've sat in silence for a moment. I said, I bet that feels better, huh? You can't see me. You can't really hear me. You have control over that. Yep, that feels good. Silence. And then he says, but I know you're there. And so I said, well, I can't do much about, me not being there. But you have a lot of control over what you can see, what you can hear, and we can work on this together. How is that? So here, right off the bat, the client walked in with his protective parts and his very unclaimed parts, right? And they were in full display. He could barely contain it. And so, this was the beginning. This was literally session number 1. We're 15 minutes into the session. I have 0 data on this person, but I have every data that I need because the soma is telling me what's needed. So trauma identities develop when the client begins to actually identify with trauma experience, right? And the present experiences are looked through the filter of these implicit memories, these body memories that are actually running the client. And some trauma identities could be, I belong to this family. That might be the experience that they had and they felt it, but they couldn't even maybe say it, but they felt that they didn't belong. And that might translate into, I don't belong to this group. I never fit in, right? Another common experience that people have that felt like they didn't fit in for some reason or rejected by the family or were abandoned or anything like that. That translates into other relationships. I'm different. I feel broken. I don't fit in. Or I can't trust my body. They become identifications and they become like truths that the person lives with, which is actually kind of tragic. It doesn't have to be this way. But because there's such strong experiences and they get reaffirmed by the lived experiences over and over again, the person really believes that's who I am. I am my trauma. We are not our trauma. Trauma is an experience, and that's not who we are. That's not all of who we are. And I find it incredibly tragic when clients come in and tell me their trauma story and also the identities that they have and how they basically have to live with us, and that's their curse in life. And it's like, no, I don't think that, I don't say that necessarily, but I'm holding this view. It's like, no, I don't think that's true. You haven't discovered who you really are. You haven't discovered that there's a whole other rich landscape beneath you. So some techniques I want to highlight of how to work with that is that we want to work with identifying these parts. We talked about that. And then we want to explore the parts, both the unclaimed parts and the adaptive parts. We want to explore them. Who are they? Who are these characters? And I often use the metaphor of the theater. Who are these characters in your theater? Who showed up in the theater today? And it's a playful way to basically saying, don't believe all your parts. They're identifications. We can play with them, but let's see if we can create some new experiences and understanding around it so that you have a choice when and how you use them. That's really shorthand for all of that. Because theater implies that, yes, it's very real in the moment, but it's also a characterization and a coping or an experience that I step into because I don't know more and better of how to be in my full self. I don't know how to relax into all of who I am because I haven't had that experience yet. And when I have, something happened so that I got compartmentalized. Then we're immersing the client. We're really immersing them in the characteristics of this part, really exploring them, somatically tracking. How is it happening? What's the shape? What's the feeling, the color, the tone, the texture? Like, how is this character, this part showing up? And that externalizing it is really helpful. But we're also building alongside somatic resources with the parts. We're building the resources of when things get overwhelming. Why don't we just pause here and bring those, that technique in that you love so much when you're taking a hand on your heart, or when we're calling up this image that you love so much in the woods, your favorite place. Let's bring that along. I'm a big supporter of including somatic resources in the service of immersing and deepening the process. So resources are not to disconnect the person, but to actually build a deeper facilitation so that they come more towards the immersive process. And then we want to help them to dialogue. Sometimes you can play with having different parts dialogue. A client can have 3, 4, 5 different parts. It can be very playful. What is the narrative that you've been part of, and what's the new narrative that want to emerge from the immersive new somatic experience? And that's key. So we're not skipping over the process. There's often a misunderstanding that when we begin to identify parts, that here's what they're meaning, and now I want to create another meaning. But there's actually a process in between, which is the unclaimed experience that we need to go through. And that's usually more the feelings, the memories, the somatic states that we're afraid of, that we need to touch in with safety. So when we go through that, then we can actually begin to dialogue with this new narrative. What wants to emerge? And I love that question. What wants to emerge? What is actually here that wants to come forth? Let's listen. And when people go, oh, this is what I want to do, or this is what I need to do, that's not emerging. That's having a plan in your mind. Helpful, but is not really the somatic truth. That's a great plan that you have. And as you say that, what is actually happening in your body right now? Well, I feel an opening. I feel kind of my heart is quivering, but it has kind of a sweet texture to it. And there's so much love streaming in right now. I feel like I can barely hold it, right? And why don't we hang out with that? Let's see what that has to say to you. But again, not from the mind, from the body. Let's see what the body has to teach you right now. Let's listen together. And so often when beautiful, awe-inspiring experiences, compassion, gratitude, sometimes will flood in. And it can be quite overwhelming. And for a trauma survivor, that can be equally overwhelming than a terror coming in. That needs also gentle scaffolding. It literally is like a huge charge in the body. And as we're healing and the fluid self begins to show up, there is almost like a positive dissonance happening. Gratitude fills the cells. The person is crying, going like, wow, I didn't realize I can feel that alive. Right? I can feel my pelvis again, or I can feel the love in my heart, whatever it is, right? So in that moment, the transformation is actually happening. And this is where, as somatic therapists, we really need to help our clients to be with that experience. So we're helping them in that moment is that deep re-remembering. And then we can offer them movements, mindful sensing. We can help them to metabolize even that new intense experience coming through. So as you're gathering from the techniques, we're starting with identification. We're building the resources alongside, but we're also immersing them into quite a depth process, because it's in the journey of the deepening into it that this new experiences will emerge.